Hi, I'm Paul. I lead engineering at LaunchDarkly for our core product and the flag delivery network our customers depend upon to get fast feature flag updates within their applications. Today I've got Adam Storm from Cockroach Labs with me today to talk about our experiences with database migrations. Adams, can you say a few words about yourself?
Sure. I work at Cockroach Labs as a director of engineering, and I've spent the last 20 plus years in the database space. In that time, I've seen a ton of complicated database migrations, and so much so that in the last few years, I've tried to focus my team on building tools that make migrations easier when moving to CockroachDB.
Great. I'm looking forward to getting into our conversation, but first we're just going to talk a bit about recent database migration at LaunchDarkly. This scene from Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark is a pivotal memory for me. If you haven't seen the film, Indiana is deep within a tomb and looking to take the golden idol. Indy knows he needs to do it without triggering the traps within the tomb, so he tries to quickly swap the statue with a bag of sand in a single smooth movement. He triumphantly starts to walk away with the statue in his hands before all the traps suddenly send off, leaving him with no option but to outrun a giant boulder hurtling towards him. Sometimes database migrations can feel like this. You carefully prepare ahead of time, planning precisely what and when things need to happen, and then make the cutover in a single smooth movement, only to have everything fall apart around you, leaving you scrambling to escape to the safety of your backups. You do have backups, right? But it doesn't need to be this way. I'm going to share 3 best practices we've developed at LaunchDarkly that have allowed us to complete migrations with zero downtime and no scrambling. As a fast-growing business, our technology needs have changed over time. To improve resilience and availability, we wanted a region-aware, distributed data store that supported serializable isolation. After a period of evaluating solutions, we chose CockroachDB. We then embarked on a gradual migration from our previous source of truth, MongoDB and PostgreSQL, to CockroachDB. As a provider of a SaaS product that our customers deem critical, we do not have the luxury of taking downtime and maintenance windows for changes. Therefore, our guiding principle throughout this migration has been that customers should never notice any changes. We also decided to take a piecemeal approach of changing one thing at a time. This meant doing an initial lift and shift to move from MongoDB to CockroachDB while retaining our data in a predominantly document-oriented data model. After this, we could then incrementally migrate the data representation into a relational database model. From the outset, we knew we wanted to build confidence in the read and write code paths we were developing for CockroachDB to know that they would work as expected when handling customer data. But we also knew that automated testing and a typical CI/CD pipeline can only really prove what you thought to test ahead of time. This brings us to the first best practice, leveraging production traffic. Using LaunchDarkly feature flags allows your application to make informed decisions about how to behave on every request, and as feature flags can be updated without deploying code changes, you can dynamically adjust that behavior at any time. In the early stages of the migration, before reading any data, we used feature flags to conditionally wrap our new code that read and wrote to CockroachDB while still serving a request in our production environment using MongoDB. While we grew our familiarity and confidence in operating CockroachDB at the scale we required, we treated these read and writes as throwaway, thereby using production traffic to generate shadow requests. With feature flag percentage rollouts, we could also dynamically dial up and down the volume of shadow requests generated from live traffic. Once it was time to start moving data, we used the same feature flag that conditionally controlled reading and writing from CockroachDB to replicate writes between new and old data stores by writing to both when the flag evaluation to the application said to do so. This dual writing was our mechanism of maintaining data consistency between the 2 data stores. Another benefit of this approach was that our application, as it was now reading from both data stores at the same time for the same logical query, was well placed to compare the returned results from both systems to allow us to verify data consistency on a request-by-request basis, surfacing any differences encountered. With these newly developed capabilities to issue shadow requests, to replicate data, and to continually verify data consistency, we next wanted to formalize our migration process. This brings us to practice number 2. Make it gradual and instantly reversible without deploying code changes. To add confidence-building steps that reduce risk and carve out safe fallback positions, we developed a 6-stage migration process. This general process is for migrating stateful data and is for a new and old system. It considers which system to read from and which to write to, along with which read result should be considered authoritative for each stage of the migration. To start with, the migration has yet to start. It's off. Only the old system is read from and written to, so only the old system can be considered authoritative. Next, we continue reading from the old, but now the application dual writes to both old and new while still returning the old result. Now that the application is actively maintaining data consistency with dual writes, we can also backfill the new system with all the data from the old system, knowing the two will remain in sync when future writes occur. At this point, there's now value in the application issuing shadow read requests to the new system, as this allows us to verify the data consistency of the two systems for the same query. At this point, the old system is still considered authoritative and is returned. If verification issues come up with the new system, they can be addressed and the data can be backfilled as needed. Later on, once we have sufficient confidence that the application can maintain data consistency in the new system, we start returning from the new system as authoritative instead. At this point, we consider the new system live, but should anything go wrong, we could still switch back to the old system as authoritative. As we develop full confidence in the new system, we can stop reading from the old system, while still continuing to write to both while we prepare to fully commit to the new system. Finally, we switch to only read and write to the new system. At this point, the application doesn't need the old system and it can be decommissioned. Using LaunchDarkly feature flags and percentage rollouts to manage this 6-stage process meant we could gradually shift traffic between each stage, one stage at a time. If something unexpected occurred, we could fall back to a prior, known safe stage while investigating. This capability gave us high confidence and allowed us to move faster, knowing we were not risking our data at any point until we decided to fully commit to the new system. This process is only one dimension of the migration, however, which brings us to our last best practice, split traffic into cohorts. We used flag targeting rules to split our traffic into a number of different cohorts. We first targeted some test accounts, which allowed us to test the migration with low-risk data. We created another cohort by targeting internal users, which allowed us to dog through the migration process ourselves with our own data before moving any customer data. As we move customer cohorts through the initial stages of the migration, we further leveraged production traffic, using customer traffic from those cohorts to generate shadow requests in production to validate data consistency in CockroachDB. As the migration progressed, we also found ourselves at times carving holdout cohorts of challenging traffic. This allowed most of the cohorts to continue through the migration process, while we simultaneously optimized queries to support our most demanding workloads found in the carve-out cohorts. This was another powerful capability, as it meant the majority of the migration to proceed rather than halting everything when we encountered an outlier. Bringing that all together, we have 3 best practices we've developed at LaunchDarkly while working on this migration. First, take advantage of production traffic to make shadow requests to the new system. Use feature flags in your application to control write replication between the two systems. Use your application's unique position to verify data consistency by reading from both databases with the same logical query and compare the results. Secondly, make your migration gradual by adding confidence-building steps to reduce risk and carve out safe fallback positions should issues arise. And finally, split your traffic into migration cohorts. Move each cohort independently through the migration and move the least risky cohorts first. Lastly, create holdouts for challenging traffic so the remainder of the migration can continue progressing. Now let's bring Adam back into the conversation. Adam, as you just saw in our example of the migration at LaunchDarkly, there's many things to consider when embarking a zero-downtime database migration. How does our experience compare with other companies that you've worked with?
Well, it's a good question. I think the experience that you had in a lot of ways is different than many of the database migrations I've seen in the past, just because it seems like you really planned ahead and took into account so many of the best practices that we see in the most successful database migrations we see. First of all, this whole notion of leveraging production traffic, it's absolutely essential when you're performing a database migration to be able to test that migration on something that's really representative of what it's going to see when you do that flip over. And the only way to really get a good sense of what things are going to look like is to test things on production traffic. So the fact that you started with that is absolutely a best practice that we see our customers use. Making it gradual, we see in the best database migrations that I've seen, customers deploy a gradual approach and really make it a cornerstone of what they're working on. And of course, we can talk more about the advantages of splitting it into cohorts.
Sure. Yeah. It's the first thing you mentioned, the leveraging production traffic. It's just been so key for us to build that confidence and be able to just try out things and know that it's low risk because we've still got the old system running there alongside. And using feature flags for that has been so powerful, as well as quickly kind of be able to kind of react to situations and kind of maybe turn off the shadow traffic just as we're ramping up ourselves on our new technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in cases where I've seen migrations go sideways in the past is where customers flip that switch and then they realize that the traffic is just completely different than what they were anticipating it would be, because they were, had tested that database on a very small sample of their production workload, or on just test synthetic workload. So using this production traffic is really a superpower that customers really need to start embrace more and more when performing their migrations.
Yeah, we've definitely found as a SaaS provider that every customer is unique, and it's not always the customers you expect to be the most challenging that are the most challenging, just in terms of like the ways in which they potentially utilize LaunchDarkly and have integrated against us, and the kind of different workloads they can then drive themselves. It's always a fascinating thing to, obviously incidents are never great and they're high stress situations, but it's always fascinating after the fact to kind of dive in and dig in and see like, where was this traffic coming from? What was that all about? And it's definitely great to be able to turn that traffic off as well when we decide that actually that's not great, and kind of that splitting into cohorts definitely helped us so much with that as well, of being able to take customers, as we discovered, kind of potentially challenging traffic, and not inflict that traffic on the new system before we're ready to kind of fully support it, and it just helps us build a better implementation because we can kind of test it and put it in and take it back out again. I'm curious about like what are the thorniest migrations you've seen?
Yeah, migrations are interesting because I think that each of them are tricky in their own way. I like to liken migrating data from one database vendor to another as something similar to moving residences. Have you moved houses recently?
Not recently, no, because it's the last experience. No, it's a very infrequent event.
Yeah, I think that's a very common reaction. Moving residences, whether it's like the act of buying or renting a new residence, or packing up all of your boxes, coordinating like the movement of your telecom billing and getting everything set up, having to move all of that stuff into a moving truck and worry about the stuff getting broken in transit. Like there's a lot to consider. And when you ask yourself like, well, then maybe, why do people move in the first place? The reason why is because they're looking for something on the other side of that move that they don't currently have. And we see that in the database world all the time. Like there's features and capabilities of a vendor that they're looking to achieve that they can't with their current vendor due to technical limitations or whatever. And so people do undertake database migrations all the time because what's waiting for them on the other side of that migration provides so much promise that they're willing to undertake some amount of discomfort to get there. But you asked specifically about the thorniest migrations. I think that the thorniest migrations I've seen are also suffer from what the most challenging residence moves I've seen, and that's really poor planning. Like I remember when I was in college and people would move from like one house to another, and they would just, get a case of beer, get a bunch of their buddies and order some pizza, and like sometimes even just carry the furniture down the street to move from one house to another. And in instances like that where you're just not really planning it out at all, things go wrong. Things get broken, dropped, stuff gets left behind. And you see that in database migrations as well. One of the things that's tricky to do to try to stretch this analogy as far as I possibly can, one of the trickiest things to do in most residential moves is that you have to, in a lot of them at least, you have to vacate your premise on the same day that you're getting into the new residence. And I'm sure for anyone who's undertaken a move of any complexity, that's really tricky to do. But at the same time, if you have these periods where there's like a grace period of like 30 days where you can gradually move your furniture over, you can do some renovations before you get in there, put a fresh coat of paint on the walls, and really thoroughly plan out how you're going to conduct that move, that's where you see the most pleasurable experience. And that really speaks to this whole, a lot of aspects that you talked about in your presentation. First of all, really planning things thoroughly, making sure that all of the steps are taken care of, making it gradual, like taking some of this furniture, moving it over, setting up a room, making sure that that room's in good shape, then bringing more furniture from the old place into the new place, and setting up another room, and so on. You can see that metaphor really extends to the database migration space as well. And this whole like splitting into cohorts applies there as well. Like you can take a gradual approach, you can move stuff over, get your billing, get your internet provider to set something up like a few days after you've moved in, and then you still have internet connectivity in the old place. You can see that the metaphor kind of rings through in that respect as well. But really this is all about, where I've seen successful migrations is all comes down to planning and being deliberate and ensuring, like you say, that you have this ability to fall back in cases where things go haywire, and then you're not in a stressful situation trying to make things work under pressure. Yeah.
Thank you for those flashbacks to the horror experiences in my earlier life of moving house at the university. You also remind me of a migration that I took on again in my earlier career, where we actually moved data centers with a small company that had a full rack of servers, and that was it. And so the only thing we could do to kind of put down the furniture in the new place was to put one server in to do the holding page while we took downtime and moved across central London from one data center to another, and then arriving at the new place only to find that the primary database server wouldn't turn back on, and then walking across central London at 3 a.m. in the morning to get to the office, where I had very carefully written down notes on how to manually promote the other server back to being the primary again, was it's etched on my mind. Like that, knowing that we were down until we could get back up again was a kind of a terrifying prospect, even with all the planning that we put into it. And the fact I had all these notes written down of how to do it, I still didn't have them with me when I needed them.
Yeah, and I think that's really what every engineer who's undertaking one of these migrations, like that's the biggest fear that they have, that they're going to be in a site down situation where now their migration has caused this, and their migration, and they're required to like resurrect the old database server or somehow work through the challenges with the migrated system before they can get things back up. But I think that just like in all other aspects of life, we can't let fear dominate ourselves and force us into a suboptimal position. And we at CockroachDB, and definitely in my past, I've seen many customers be successful on this migration journey, provided that they take the steps, some of which you've talked about here, to be deliberate, to plan things out, to not go full force into something, to do things gradually, and really to not be pressured either by their management, their executives, or their customers to force a migration sooner than is naturally the case.
Yeah, we've been very fortunate with our migration that we've been able to do it on such a gradual process. Like it's been, a continual piece of work for over a year now, but it's not been the primary piece of work. We've been able to carry on, focus on building kind of new product features and functionality, and improving the customer experience, and not stop the world while we kind of have to get it done as quickly as possible. So that's been a really helpful way of doing it, and definitely I've seen migrations at other places that did not have those luxuries, and that's a tricky place to go. But yeah, in terms of kind of making it gradual, the old adage of like, if it's hard to do it more often, definitely applies here. All of these things that we've done have allowed us to kind of make this migration a boring migration, and that's boring in the most kind of positive possible sense of it's just straightforward and we carry on doing it. And yes, there are challenges, and yes, there are things that we need to kind of think through and work on, and it's just normal work. It's not a 3-alarm fire at 2 a.m. in the morning with everyone trying to work out what to do huddled on a Zoom call.
Yeah.
So that makes me very grateful.
Yeah, and I think that you also bring up another good point, which is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach for database migrations. Like there are best practices, as you've highlighted, but every migration is unique and every customer is unique. And so the best approach for one customer may not be the best approach for another. Let me give you some examples. Like there are customers that we deal with, and I've dealt with in my past, that have a cyclical nature to their business. Like if they're in the financial space, like they're dealing with financial transactions 9 to 5 approximately Monday to Friday, and on the weekends, like the traffic is far lower. For customers like that, to do migration in a gradual sense and in a way where they've engineered the system so that they could transition live production traffic at a certain point in time, it takes a ton of planning, and customers like that can often take some amount of downtime on the weekend to do maybe not like a big bang approach where they're completely shifting over, but they can take this downtime periods and do much more rigorous testing on a new production system where they've moved data over gradually during the week. Whereas there are other customers that can take almost zero downtime ever. And those customers really have to take a much more exhaustive planned approach. And I think that one of the first things that I always ask a customer when they're undertaking a migration is, what is this migration, what need to look like at your company? Like, can you take downtime? What are the timelines that you need to move this data over by? Thinking through all of these fundamental questions about the migration will lead to far better outcomes for all parties involved.
Yeah, that's a great point. Of different customers have different kind of requirements or constraints. I remember the first time I talked with someone who worked at a stock exchange, and my eyes popped out of my head when they said, "Yeah, we just turn off the servers at 5 p.m. every day," and it was just a completely alien model of working for me, and it's obviously very intense, and like you need to kind of you need to be up those hours between 9 and 5, but like the kind of the luxury of being able to turn stuff off and make those kind of migrations out of band is a fascinating situation to find yourself in.
Yeah, it's certainly the case that there's no such thing as a free lunch. The customers that can incur the downtime often face this just massively increased pressure if they experience any unexpected downtime during their business hours. Like, I think a lot of customers would be very happy to know that if they have a few minutes of downtime, they don't have to incur an SEC investigation and have to like perhaps be paraded in front of congressional investigations. So there are things that not being able to incur downtime ever, there are implications to that, and there are also implications to these other situations. But yeah, it's an interesting point that you raise about the fact that there's certain vendors that have, or certain customers that have advantages that others don't.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's it's still worth looking at, like these batch practices. I think there's some application for those even then, even if the actual thing has to happen in a downtime window. There's still ways of de-risking that and making it a softer approach and building the confidence you want to know that it's going to go well, by kind of using like LaunchDarkly feature flags to kind of be able to test it out with the production traffic ahead of time.
Yeah, I do think that even if you are able to incur downtime, like you say, having this ability to use production traffic and filter it off at a time when you are at peak load, and have the ability to switch back and forth between the old production system and the new production system. It does have some significant benefits even in those instances where you can incur downtime, because you can do all of this great testing ahead of time and you have this fallback mechanism available to you. And so these are just additional tools that are in the database migrators toolbox to be used even in situations where downtime is a possibility.
Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Yeah, it's really been my pleasure as well.